A soldier's bare foot pressed into the jagged, frozen mud of Pennsylvania. Ragged strips of burlap bled crimson as they tightened around his frostbitten skin. 4,000 men stood shivering in the biting wind, officially declared unfit for duty. They lacked shoes, they lacked shirts, and they lacked the basic means to survive. By February 1778, the Continental Army existed in name only, a skeletal force held together by starvation. This was not a war of grand maneuvers, but a desperate, silent struggle against the winter itself. On December 19, 1777, the column of 12,000 soldiers trudged into the valley. George Washington chose this high ground to watch the British forces occupying Philadelphia. The army arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and broken dreams of victory. They immediately set to work felling trees to build crude log huts. Each structure measured only 14 feet by 16 feet, housing 12 men in cramped, dark quarters. Smoke from green wood fires hung heavy in the air, stinging eyes and lungs. Rations dwindled to a mixture of flour and water known as fire cake. The men baked the thin, hard patties on flat rocks near the edges of their campfires. Nourishment became a secondary concern to the creeping spread of disease. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia moved through the huts with lethal efficiency. The camp became a landscape of burial pits and suffering. Between 1,800 and 2,500 soldiers perished before the snows finally melted. The British military command in Philadelphia observed the reports of the American decline with indifference. General William Howe kept his troops in the warm, captured city, far from the frozen misery of the valley. The Continental Congress watched from York, struggling to provide the basic supplies requested by the camp. Washington monitored the dwindling supply of gunpowder and the rising list of the dead. The revolution teetered on the edge of total collapse, defined by the simple absence of wool, leather, and grain. Each morning, the sentries counted the men who failed to emerge from their huts. The question of whether the army would exist by spring remained an open, terrifying uncertainty. A quill scratched across parchment in the cold stillness of March 1778. George Washington signed the order, appointing Nathanael Greene as quartermaster general. The camp at Valley Forge required a total transformation of its crumbling supply chain. Nathanael Greene surveyed the empty storehouses and the starving workhorses. He established a new system to acquire grain from the surrounding Pennsylvania farms. Wagons began to rumble along the rutted roads leading into the valley. Barrels of salted pork and bags of flour arrived at the camp gates. The soldiers abandoned the thin, watery fire cakes for more consistent rations. Spring rains washed away the worst of the deep, frozen mud. Green shoots appeared in the fields, providing essential forage for the surviving livestock. Nathanael Greene reorganized the distribution of blankets and leather shoes. The supply officers tracked every shipment from the remote depots to the individual huts. Soldiers emerged from their shelters with new shirts and sturdy footwear. The physical state of the army shifted from skeletal endurance to basic functionality. Nathanael Greene stabilized the flow of gunpowder and lead into the armory. The Continental Army finally possessed the logistical foundation for formal military training. The men regained enough strength to stand in formation for extended periods. Each crate of supplies served as a building block for a professional fighting force. The chaos of the winter began to recede under disciplined administrative oversight. The army now possessed the calories and clothing necessary for the coming campaign. The quartermaster's success turned the tide of the camp's internal crisis. Could this newly nourished force master the complex maneuvers required to face the British? A heavy wooden gate creaked open on February 23, 1778. A man in a worn European uniform rode into the slush of the Valley Forge camp. This was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a former Prussian staff officer. He observed men huddled in rags without formal military posture. The Continental Army lacked a singular, unified method of drill. Officers struggled to move their companies across the uneven, muddy ground. Von Steuben identified the primary failure as a lack of standardized movement. He requested permission from George Washington to organize a model company. 100 men stepped forward from the ranks of the shivering infantry. Von Steuben stood before them in the center of a cleared parade ground. He carried a musket to demonstrate the manual of arms himself. The soldiers watched as he moved with the precision of a seasoned Prussian professional. He broke every complex maneuver into simple, repeatable segments. The men practiced the loading sequence until their fingers moved without hesitation. Von Steuben corrected their posture with sharp gestures and loud commands. He discarded the outdated, chaotic methods previously used by the militia units. Each soldier in the model company learned to move in perfect, rhythmic alignment. These 100 men became the instructors for the rest of the camp. They spread out to their respective regiments to replicate the Prussian drill. The chaos of the training ground began to fade into organized, quiet movement. Discipline replaced the aimless wandering that had defined the winter months. The transformation of the army relied on this methodical, repetitive instruction. Could these men translate their new skills into an effective defense against British regulars? A stack of ink-stained papers rested on a wooden desk in the commander's quarters. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben dipped his quill into a heavy glass inkwell. He drafted the instructions that would govern the Continental Army's future movements. The document formally outlined the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops. Soldiers eventually referred to this standardized manual simply as the Blue Book. Von Steuben surveyed the parade ground where the model company stood in formation. He observed the soldiers fumbling with their heavy, iron-barreled muskets. The loading process previously involved dozens of chaotic, uncoordinated individual steps. Von Steuben slowed the sequence down to teach a precise, singular rhythm. He demonstrated the motion of biting the cartridge to expose the powder. The soldiers mimicked his movements until the motion became a fluid, practiced habit. Uniformity replaced the previous confusion of mixed militia training styles. Each man learned to prime, load, and fire in a singular rapid-fire sequence. The volley fire became a disciplined, singular sound across the training field. Von Steuben walked the lines to ensure every soldier aligned his feet perfectly. He corrected the stance of a young rifleman with a sharp, physical gesture. The muskets leveled with the horizon in one singular horizontal plane. The rate of fire increased as the men mastered the standardized manual of arms. Von Steuben turned his attention to the steel bayonets hanging at their belts. Soldiers previously treated the bayonet as a tool for cutting wood or cooking. He ordered the men to fix the blades to the muzzles of their muskets. The soldiers practiced the lunge and the parry under the spring sun. The bayonet transformed from a camp utility into a primary weapon of war. The model company moved as a single organism across the Pennsylvania mud. Their maneuvers reflected the rigid standards of the professional European military. Von Steuben watched the lines hold steady against the imaginary pressure of an enemy. The Blue Book provided the blueprint for this structural and tactical overhaul. Copies of the manual circulated through the regiments as the weather warmed. The Continental Army shed its reputation as a collection of disorganized farmers. Officers studied the illustrations within the pages to lead their companies effectively. The training ground echoed with the rhythmic cadence of marching boots. Discipline became the defining characteristic of the camp's daily routine. The transformation of the fighting force was now etched into written law. Could this new professional standard survive the chaos of an actual battlefield? Mud caked the boots of the men patrolling the perimeter of Valley Forge. Louis Duportail walked the frozen ridge lines overlooking the Schuylkill River. He measured the elevation of the terrain with a brass surveying instrument. The French military engineer planned a series of redoubts to guard the camp. He marked the earth with wooden stakes to indicate the placement of artillery. Soldiers dug deep trenches into the hard, frost-covered ground. They hauled heavy logs to build elevated defensive platforms. These fortifications protected the army from a potential British assault from Philadelphia. Louis Duportail ensured the camp remained a secure bastion against the enemy. Inside the command tent, a map of the region laid flat on a table. Marquis de Lafayette pointed to the shifting lines of the British Army. He served as a vital bridge between the American commanders and the French court. He organized his division with the tactical knowledge gained in European theaters. His presence signaled the growing importance of international support for the rebellion. George Washington consulted with the Marquis de Lafayette on the status of the troops. The two men reviewed the logistics of the camp's defenses and supply chains. The arrival of spring brought the first signs of relief to the starving ranks. Nathanael Greene coordinated the arrival of wagons filled with fresh flour and meat. The soldiers abandoned their diet of fire cake for more substantial rations. News arrived from Europe regarding the progress of American diplomats in Paris. A courier delivered official documents confirming the Treaty of Alliance with France. The Army received word of the formal agreement on May 6, 1778. George Washington ordered a grand parade to celebrate the military partnership. Thousands of soldiers assembled on the parade ground under a clear spring sky. Cannons fired a salute that echoed across the Pennsylvania hills. The men displayed their new discipline in a series of coordinated maneuvers. They practiced the standardized movements found in the Blue Book. The Marquis de Lafayette reviewed the ranks with pride and professional focus. The alliance provided the Continental Army with a new sense of legitimacy. Soldiers stood straighter as they marched in formation before their commanders. The grim reality of the winter deaths faded into the promise of spring operations. The army now possessed the structure and the external support to challenge the British. Could these refined tactics hold firm against the professional might of the Crown? The morning of June 19, 1778, arrived with a heavy mist over the Schuylkill River. George Washington ordered the final tents struck at Valley Forge. Soldiers dismantled the log huts that had served as their winter shelter. 12,000 men moved in synchronized columns toward the eastern horizon. The army marched away from the site of their greatest hardship. They tracked the movement of British forces abandoning Philadelphia. General William Howe's troops moved through New Jersey toward the coast. Washington's men followed the British across the humid landscape. The heat of the New Jersey summer intensified with every passing mile. Soldiers carried their muskets with the rhythmic precision learned in the spring. The Blue Book dictated the spacing of every platoon. They reached the outskirts of Monmouth Courthouse on June 28. The British rear guard held the high ground near the village. Washington ordered his forward divisions to engage the enemy line. The Continental soldiers deployed into professional formation under the summer sun. Muskets leveled in unison across the open fields. Smoke from the first volley obscured the sight of the opposing lines. The British regulars returned fire with disciplined, practiced speed. The American lines held their position despite the intensity of the assault. Soldiers utilized the bayonet maneuvers perfected in the training camp. The Continental Army stood its ground against the professional might of the Crown. The Battle of Monmouth lasted for the duration of the sweltering day. The army Washington commanded functioned as a singular, unified force. The transformation from a collection of militias to a professional army was complete. The British forces eventually disengaged and continued their march toward Sandy Hook. The Continental Army held the field as the sun set over the Monmouth Plains. The winter of starvation and the lessons of the drill field found their purpose. You stare at the history books, believing these cold, starving men are safely behind a veil of centuries. But the same cycle of sudden, brutal necessity is waiting for you. The pressure is already building, and when the cracks appear, you will find that the order you rely on is just as fragile as a winter hut.